Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Climate Action webinar, Water, Resilient Sustainable Outcomes, Part 1, Design Approaches for Buildings at Risk of Flooding or Sea Level Rise. AIA California recognizes that the planet is experiencing an urgent climate emergency and that California should continue to elevate its position as a global leader in addressing the grave challenges of advancing climate change. To help do this, AIA California has developed an in-depth educational climate action webinar series that incorporates the AIA framework for design excellence and includes zero net carbon design education. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides the learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the PDF presentation that can be made available online. A few quick housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the AIA California website, www.aiacalifornia.org, along with any additional resources shortly after today's session. Today's session qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units for those watching live, and AIA California staff will report these units for you. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Questions that are not answered in the webinar can be made available on our website. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Nathan Ogle, AIA, is the founder of 12 CHC Design Management, an architectural real estate, contract, entitlements, and design consulting business centered in the San Francisco Bay Area with award-winning design projects locally and beyond. His career spans practice, academia, business, and construction, and he writes extensively on sustainability, culture, thought, and design trends. He currently serves as chair of the AIA California Urban Design Committee and Board of Governors chairman for San Francisco Nonprofit Agency, while educating students around the world as an online foundation instructor in the School of Architecture at the Academy of Art, San Francisco. Nathan was recently named a John S. Bowles Fellow by AIA California. Nathan?
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's program, Design Approaches for Buildings at Risk of Flooding or Sea Level Rise. We have a question. What is the architect's role in resilient design? Our buildings and communities are vulnerable to a wide range of short and long-term risks from climate change. Changes in climate patterns will have huge implications on existing buildings and how architects need to think about design and retrofit for increased resilience. This webinar session will introduce architects to the factors they need to consider when designing for future riverine, precipitation, and coastal flooding conditions, and how architects can discuss the design and operational implications with their clients. I'd now like to introduce one of today's speakers, Robin Seidel, AIA, Resiliency Architect and 2022 Chairperson for the AIA National Resilience and Adaptation Advisory Group. Robin has been at the forefront of integrating resilience into design and planning. She focuses on not only addressing climate change, but also ensuring that her projects benefit environmentally disenfranchised populations. Her technical expertise is in city resilience, building and infrastructure adaptation, vulnerability assessments, sustainable design, transportation, and stakeholder engagement. Robin is committed to developing innovative solutions for complex, climate resilient issues for clients. Welcome, Robin. Our next speaker is Kenneth Felarski, FAIA. Ken is principal and founder of Felarski Architecture, Planning and Research, an integrated architecture and planning ecology design firm and research workshop, recognized with many awards, including the Building Value into Housing National Award from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Ken is the 2021-22 co-chair of the AIA Disaster Assistance Committee and is a contributing author to the AIA Disaster Assistance Handbook, 4th edition. Ken is also the AIA Disaster Assistance Coordinator for Rhode Island and the New England region, and is also a founder and chair of the U.S. Green Building Council, Rhode Island. We are very excited to hear from our speakers today, so Robin will start us off. Please take it away, Robin.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right. All right. So thank you so much for having me here today with all of you. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the resilience and adaptation work related to architecture that I've been doing in Massachusetts. Similar to California, Massachusetts has been very proactive in addressing the impacts of climate change. And I've been really fortunate in my career to work with the state and some major cities such as Cambridge and Boston on their climate resilience initiatives. And we always like to say that we didn't get hit by Hurricane Sandy, but we sure act like we did. And it definitely could have happened. In 2018, we had 2 nor'easters, which caused many millions of dollars in damage from coastal flooding in downtown Boston. So we know it's coming. I want to start my presentation with the tale of 2 buildings, new and existing. And we as architects often focus on how to mitigate climate change through building design, through the reduction of operational and embodied carbon. And frankly, it's much easier to design a building for future climate conditions now. And especially since now there's really great data out there to help us make these design decisions. But buildings last a really long time. And here in the Northeast, we have buildings dating back to the 1600s. I owned a house in Salem, Massachusetts, which was built in 1800 and in great condition. And I basically expect it to last for another 100 years, at least. So we have this other issue, right? Which doesn't get talked about a lot. And we need to ask ourselves, is it really climate smart and equitable to knock down every existing building and build something higher and more efficient? So we as architects need to understand the full picture when making decisions about adaptation, how to mitigate the impact of climate change through design build of new buildings, but also how to adapt the buildings we already have. And I'm going to start with Cambridge, Massachusetts, home to Harvard and MIT. And I would call it the East Coast version of Silicon Valley. It's home to many biotech and big pharma giants. And if you got the Moderna vaccine for COVID, it definitely came from Cambridge. So Cambridge is a really interesting and diverse community with a lot of different demographics. And you have the uber wealthy, and then you have some of the most economically vulnerable populations mixed with a really transient student population. And on the screen, you'll see some geographic context for Cambridge if you're not familiar. Really an inland community. Rivers flanking both sides. So there's the Mystic River to the north, the Charles River to the south. And that really this area is pretty low in elevation. There's high groundwater. The 2 red circles there where we have big dams, the purpose of the dams, honestly, is to regulate the rivers, but it's also to prevent the ocean water from backing up into the rivers and flooding the communities. We have a lot of tunnels, a subway system that goes underground, and a lot of utility tunnels, specifically on the college campuses. There's a lot of underground tunnels running around. And in Massachusetts, our 3 greatest climate threats are coastal flooding, extreme precipitation, and extreme heat. Heat is actually projected to be the biggest killer scenario because we just don't know how to handle it here. And our buildings, shockingly, our old buildings really don't have good insulation, even though we get really cold temperatures. They're just not made for it. And people don't think we're just not the type of area that's really grown up with using air conditioning. Some people did, I did, but it's just not something that's on the forefront of people's minds. So we don't know how to handle it when we have these really extreme heat conditions. I'm going to focus my presentation today on flooding though. And we have these really huge tidal swings every day as our tides from the ocean rise and fall, somewhere between 9 and 12 feet difference every single day. And we're expecting a little over 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Right now, during lunar high tides, which we call wicked high tides, we see flooding in low-lying areas along the coast. And I mentioned extreme precipitation is one of the other climate hazards that we look at. And so, when I talk about extreme precipitation, I mean flash flooding and these like high intensity, short and long duration rainstorms. We have the opposite problem that you guys have. We have too much rain, and our infrastructure is really old. Most of the piped infrastructure was built at least 30 years ago, and basically included sizing for like a 25-year storm then. But we already have capacity issues due to the impervious surface issues caused by more development, and we've also been getting larger rainstorms. So we know that the 25-year storm today is going to be more frequent in the future, what we'll call the 10-year storm. So remember those two buildings I showed at the beginning of the presentation? They're located in the neighborhood circled on the map. This is the Cambridge Flood Viewer. I suggest Googling this tool after the presentation. It's pretty neat. You can select your parcel or any parcel in Cambridge and get a pop-up of flood elevations for your specific property. And I'm sure you're thinking, oh my God, how does this impact property values? Now, again, this is Cambridge, so it really hasn't. Cambridge real estate is really sought after and valuable. So we haven't seen the dip. And this also is not a regulatory tool yet, but it is a baseline. It's the first step towards getting there. And a lot of property owners and the city use this tool as a basis of design for infrastructure improvements and to provide guidance to residents and property owners. Another baseline that was developed for the city was this Resilient Cambridge plan. There's a summary report, a more detailed plan and roadmap, a handbook to help implementers take action, and a lot of technical and scientific research to back up the plan. Because again, this is Cambridge. We need science to back this stuff up. And I was really fortunate to be one of the leaders of this effort, and I particularly focused on building adaptation. So part of the research I did for this project is to first start with a better understanding of what already existed. In 2019, Cambridge had just over 14,000 buildings. The majority of the buildings were 1 to 3 family residential. Quantity, though, is not the only consideration here. We also looked at square footage. And the reason why we looked at square footage is because when you're costing adaptation to climate change, you're often doing it at a square footage level. So you're saying X dollars per X square feet. So what's really interesting here is that, well, yes, small residential does make up, 17%, or it's the majority, like I said, it is the majority of the buildings in Cambridge, but it only makes up about 17% of the square footage. Research and development buildings, higher ed, larger commercial buildings are really what make up the majority of the square footage. And keep in mind, this is all context because we're trying to create a baseline to figure out how do we give guidance on how to prepare for climate change. It's really overwhelming sometimes. So next we evaluated all the buildings in Cambridge for coastal and precipitation flooding. And some interesting things to note here: 287 buildings are already in the FEMA 1% floodplain and have to comply with the building code. So in Massachusetts, we use the FEMA 1% or the FEMA AE floodplain to sort of dictate how you need to design for your building. And so we can assume that if a major renovation were to occur on a building, they would have to bring it up to at least FEMA now, if it wasn't already at FEMA. And or their mortgage would require, because of the type of mortgage they have, would require them to have flood insurance. But there's a huge gap between that 287 buildings in the FEMA floodplain and the, say, 3,700 number that you see that likely don't have flood insurance to help them out if something were to happen. So we dug in a little bit more. There are 800 buildings at risk of flooding from the 2070 10% event, whether it's sea level rise, storm surge, or precipitation event. Cambridge in particular is actually, even though it's kind of an inland community, it's exposed to coastal flooding because we're expecting water to go around the dams by around 2050 and flood the upstream communities. So it's not necessarily not affected by coastal flooding. Of the 800-ish buildings at risk of sea level rise or precipitation, 118 of those are at risk of both, and those events can occur simultaneously. So most of the buildings that are at risk are unsurprisingly small residential and medium residential, and then we have about 90 to 100 small businesses. Higher education represented 8% of the square footage at risk. We have a few historic buildings and critical facilities. And I want to note critical facilities for a moment because we particularly paid attention to those and prioritized the adaptation of those facilities because they play such a critical role in emergency response. So I'm talking hospitals, the DPW facility, DPW, Department of Public Works, if that's not a familiar term to you, because they're the ones responding to flooding emergencies. So we need to make sure that they're up and able and ready to go when the time comes to respond to these circumstances. So what does this mean going back to our two buildings? Well, the building you see here, the Finch, is a new multifamily, I think, low moderate income building. And they built this building with the mindset of future flooding. So this building is built to withstand the 20, 70, 10% storm events. And the utilities are elevated, there's no basement. They took the guidelines we developed and used them in the process of designing this building. It's also it meets passive house standards, which is really interesting because then we know that this building, it has even more resilience so that if power in the surrounding communities goes out, we're assuming residents will remain comfortable in their own home. So for the existing, like I said before, it's way easier to actually adapt or like to plan for climate resilience in new buildings. Existing buildings, the recommendations to protect, retrofit your building for the 10% event. This is not code. So right now the city is focusing on providing education and resources to homeowners to adapt. And you would be surprised that many of the larger property owners, such as the universities and R&D facilities, have actually taken it upon themselves to perform an assessment of their built assets and on their own are adapting and retrofitting through deployable solutions or permanent solutions as part of their regular capital improvement process. Knowing that most of the buildings are exposed are small residential and unlikely to have the means to adapt, the city is looking into programs and other solutions at a neighborhood scale. So we identified neighborhoods with the highest risk of precipitation and coastal flooding. And then through this method, we were able to come up with programs to support neighborhoods or large scale infrastructure improvement investments for the city to take on to reduce risk. There are definitely trade-offs. Real estate is very valuable in Cambridge and the city definitely benefits from that. So another solution that I'll mention here is managed retreat. As you can see, managed retreat is not always the most popular idea when it comes to dense urban environments. It's actually really tricky. And so the way we kind of discuss this here is actually vertical retreat. And we talk about that a lot in really dense urban environments. And so essentially what we're looking at is outlying residential units and bedrooms in basements. We have a lot of basement apartments. And as we saw this summer when Hurricane Ida went through New York City, we did see a lot of incidences of people dying because they were living in basement apartments. So in addition to developing planning and policy documents for retrofitting buildings, I've actually been helping clients do the design for their retrofits. And now I want to talk about some of the considerations and lessons I've learned from retrofitting buildings. there's not one solution to adapting to flooding. The type of solution really depends on a lot of different factors. It's kind of the snowflake idea. And so first I want to break it down by flooding. Extreme precipitation is a very fast rising, often unpredictable occurrence, and it can be very, very, very variable in that leaves blocking a catch basin could cause flooding. So it's kind of hard to prepare. We do have models which are called H&H models that can sort of figure out where flooding is likely to occur based on size of pipes underground and low areas where water is likely to go to. And so I'll just say that rarely are deployables a good solution with precipitation flooding. And when you have deployables, you're really relying on someone to deploy them. And there's always that option for human error. What I always like to talk about with clients when we talk about how to mitigate flooding from precipitation events is blue-green roofs, minimizing impervious surfaces, making sure drainage around your property is really in good condition. It's a lot of maintenance that's within your control, and then assuming that the city will help to mitigate those issues through infrastructure improvements. So coastal flooding and riverine flooding. The key is that you usually have time to prepare with these types of events, but really the goal is preventing building failure. So in these cases, it's understanding the structural capacity to withstand hydrodynamic and hydrostatic loads. And in many cases in existing floodplains, you're not allowed to dry flood-proof a building according to the building code. But when considering future flooding, you really need to understand the data and the technical implications when deciding whether or not to dry or wet flood-proof your building. There's this gray area, right, of what's required from a regulatory perspective and what you can actually do. So you have to, it really requires you to dig a little bit deeper to find the right solution. And again, there is no one solution for resilience and adaptation. There are many variables, and last but not least is cost. Adaptation is not resilience when the solution is inequity. Very important to know. So I also want to share some standards and regulations which are really shaping the landscape in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, which we so nicely call SHMCAP, was released in September 2018. And this is a FEMA recognized plan that incorporates forward-looking climate change risks into the Commonwealth's Hazard Mitigation Plan. In 2019, the governor officially launched the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team, we call RMAT, which will be responsible for the plan's implementation, monitoring, and maintenance. And over 100 agency action items were identified to implement this plan, including priority interagency actions. So incorporating climate change, vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation standards into any budgeting, coordination, and capital planning, reviewing and updating design standards, and incorporating adaptation standards into capital planning for new projects. This all came together in a tool, an easy to use free tool, because it's very complicated, called the Climate Resilience Design Standards Tool. We're trying to work on a better name. It's a mouthful. So the tool provides project outputs that are intended to be used for climate resilience planning and design of infrastructure, buildings, and natural resources. And really what this tool spits out for you is climate exposure and risk rating and recommended resilience design standards. And so some of the additional supporting documentation that's provided in this tool will be site suitability considerations, regional coordination, because we're working on trying to get this, climate change and flooding does not acknowledge jurisdictional boundaries. So we're really trying to work together on this to solve this problem. And this is all intended to be used with traditional engineering and architectural design assessments. So like I said, this tool is free, and we've come up with a bunch of different users who this would be best suited for. So essentially project managers, program managers, asset owners, technical staff. And it's really intended to inform planning and design projects with physical assets. And it can be used through the typical life cycle of a design project. And right now, this tool is used in a bunch of different grant applications. For instance, if you apply for an environmental permit in Massachusetts, before you can even get the environmental permit, you need to run your project through this tool to find out what your climate risk is, and then in your permit, respond to how you are mitigating that risk. So we're working on integrating this into the process that would make designers and engineers think a little bit more critically about how to implement resilience. And so some of the key takeaways from this tool is that it really aims to standardize the use of climate projections across the entire state. It provides science-based methodologies for how the standards were developed, and it's free for all. So having access to good climate data and understanding it shouldn't necessarily be a barrier for all the projects across the state. And so now I wanted to share another example of an active regulatory process that's happening in Boston. So Article 25 went into effect last fall, and it requires property owners over a certain square footage to build above the 2071% coastal flood elevation. And I really should mention here, I forgot to mention before, that Massachusetts has its own coastal flood model called the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. We're very innovative with naming things. Which is a high-resolution probabilistic model, which includes water surface elevations, wave heights, and all of that across 3 time horizons. And the number at the bottom right-hand side of the screen is what I want to show you. So if you go to look at the zoning for your project and what you need to comply with, you'll see this number, 19.5. That's the base flood elevation for the site. So in addition to the base flood elevation, so that's the minimum elevation that you can have and a floor in your building. So they're trying to prevent basements from happening below that number or anything else that you would add that cannot be floodable. In addition to that number, they have some freeboard recommendations. If you're not familiar with the term freeboard, freeboard is the factor of safety that you add to these numbers. Gives you a little bit of extra cushion in case they're kind of off, because they're models, and it's an average across an area, so it could give or take a couple of inches. And usually the freeboard recommendation is 1 to 2 feet based on the criticality of the building. In addition to the zoning that you must comply with, there is a design guidance document that helps owners adapt their buildings or prepare their design. So for instance, before, remember I mentioned in Cambridge, we're looking at removing basement apartments. In this case in Boston, if you get rid of your basement in your building, you get a density bonus. So you can actually add a story on top of your building if you're in this flood zone area. I literally just had a client yesterday say that they could not build. They're really struggling when they have to elevate their buildings because they have to match the sidewalk grade. And so this document also provides some examples of how to transition people from the sidewalk up into the building above the flood zone. It also provides guidance on dry floodproofing with deployables and elevating equipment. And one thing I really want to note here with deployables, because I do a lot of deployable flood protection design, is I strongly encourage flood operation plans. In Boston, if you're blocking egress, even if the building is evacuated, you need to notify the fire department and a whole bunch of other folks. about the deployment, and they also require you to test the system once a year. So there's this additional planning document that needs to go along, which is who makes the decision of when to deploy, who's responsible, who do you actually call to get the staff available or help to deploy. And as mentioned earlier, I'm the chairperson this year for the AIA Resilience and Adaptation group. And here's the landing page here. If you want to check it out, you can also search AIA and Resilience. But we've been developing a whole bunch of guidance documents to help architects through this process. And where I like to sort of start is, as mentioned at the earliest part of this presentation, what's really the role of architects in resilience? And to me, there's 3 roles. It's design, advisory, and helping with recovery. And I think we're uniquely suited for working in this world because we really understand the big picture. So we have the ability to really think through how people will use something versus, the goal might be to protect a building and you put a wall around it, but maybe that wall is not the right solution. And I think we really do have the skill set to be able to think more about the right solutions. And as I mentioned, there are a few documents that we've developed to help support architects. One is the Architect's Guide to Business Continuity. There's a hazard and climate risk acknowledgement form to help you talk through acknowledging risk with your clients. And then coming soon, I was hoping it would be out by now. It's in final production stages, is going to be a resilient project process guide, which will help you integrate resilience into all of your projects, into every phase of design in your projects. I think, do I have a couple? All right. I will very, very, very quickly go through. I have a case study, a really quick case study. I'm going to fly through it because I just want to share it. So I've been working with the city of Boston for a long time, and it really started with the neighborhood of East Boston, which is near the airport. It's the neighborhood that the airport's in, if you've ever flown into Boston. And this is Clipper Ship Wharf. It was done by the architectural team, which is a local architecture company. Was not involved in the design of this project, but I love it. I think it's like such a great example. But back in 2016, I had helped on this coastal resilience solutions for East Boston, which was a plan identifying the risk of flooding in East Boston. Clipper Ship Wharf is that little red icon in the middle of the screen. And we've identified a whole bunch of different flood pathways. I've been working with the city for a while to block flood pathways. This is an environmental justice community. And so Clipper Ship Wharf, as I mentioned, is a very interesting site. It was a former waterfront industrial site. They elevated the site from like elevation 14 to 25 at the center of the site. This was a private developer, Lend-Lease. They also integrated a living shoreline into this project. And so this is kind of in some ways an island on the waterfront. Can kind of give you an example in this next picture. So up on the right-hand side, that's that elevation 25. And all along the building, in the front of the building, they provided a harbor walk and a publicly accessible harbor walk for residents of the neighborhood to use. So it's a really interesting project. And then last year I had the opportunity of trying to figure out how do we fill in the gaps along the waterfront between buildings that are building to this high standard that the city of Boston set out. So on the far right-hand side, you can see there's a building with a high elevation of 22.5. Clipper Ship's, the highest elevation is 25. There's another one in the upper left-hand corner, which you can't quite see, but that's also at, I think, 22.5. So we chose 22.5 as our design flood elevation using the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model that I mentioned. And in that area, those dotted areas that say Lewis Mall and Carlton Wharf, we look to figure out how to connect to the buildings and provide an urban design opportunity to provide flood resilience for the community of East Boston. I'm going to flip through this quickly. This is just an analysis of how we got to our design flood elevation using all the different models available. Again, we picked 22.5 as our number. And I just kind of want to show you some of the renderings. So we were able to elevate the harbor walk to make it last longer. We tried to bring back the landscape from the water. So rather than building into the water and taking away floodplain, we were trying to peel back the layers to allow the water and the natural resources to expand. And then we have built in the we're building in the flood protection into this sort of like integrated wall system so that we can get up to elevation 22.5. On the other side, we again elevated the harbor walk, and back in the back corner, we've connected it back to the clipper ship building. And I just want to note, like, it's, as I said before, protecting and providing for resilience in communities is not a one property solution. Everybody, I feel like, has been very much in this process together here, and we're trying, like, everybody, all the community partners, the neighbors, the private owners have been really supportive and helpful in looking to resolve this issue together. So I think it's a really amazing thing that we had a true like public-private partnership and come in connecting public space to a private building. And that's all I have. I know I went a minute or two over. Thank you so much again for having me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robin, so much for such a robust amount of information. I do want to make note, we do have a Q&A tab that you're welcome to insert your questions for both Robin and Ken. We will have a nice panel discussion towards the end of this presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ken. Take it away, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. I'm going to share the screen. Let's see. I really appreciate Robin's presentation, and hopefully I can, well, number one, I talk fast. So, and it's interesting, Robin mentioned ASC 2414. I was on the committee that authored that document. And ASC has a very interesting methodology of how they get to the end product. It's very, very structured. And it was mentioned, I'm co-chair of the AIA Disaster Assistance Committee on 2021 and 2022. And Robin's committee and our committee will be meeting, I guess, in August. So that's good news. AIA is bringing together like-minded and like-directed committees. I always like to start with a big picture. Through this, I tend to talk fast. There are a number of slides that are just images. So if you don't hear me talking, don't get nervous. Sometimes I get nervous and I start talking about slides that have pictures that are self-evident. So when talking about the big picture, I always like to think about art. And here's a nice picture of what seems to be art, but it's really not. These are all shipping containers. And there are shipping containers that were thrown about with the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. And this graphic, I mean, it's a wonderful graphic just for colors alone, but you could see the power of that earthquake and tsunami, the force all across the Pacific Rim. It's just startling. There's one of the slides I don't have to talk about. Robin showed some AIA publications. Well, there's another one we're very proud of. The Disaster Assistance Committee last September published the Disaster Assistance Handbook. It's basically a compendium of the disaster cycle and the recovery cycle, and it's well organized, and it's a good starting point. And I urge all of you to to download. It's for free from the AIA website. And this is the emergency management cycle. Many of you are familiar with it. Disaster event, you have response, recovery, go back to normal, status quo, mitigation, and preparedness. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. But in disasters, and part of the thing about, we're talking about water and riverine and coastal flooding, but they're part of the larger disaster picture. And what we need to do is communicate on disasters, not only on many levels, but all the time in a continuum. And Robin had mentioned this as well, but we need to communicate the value of design with our communities after a disaster event and actually beforehand as public servant architects, so to speak. This is in the AIA Handbook, Disaster Assistance Handbook, the sort of hexagon of community resilience: economic prosperity, natural resources, hazard mitigation, climate change, social equity, health, safety, and wellness. So we have to have some more ideas and start thinking about these things. And one of the things that I have to get rid of this. I don't know if I can get rid of it. Yeah, there it goes. I had to get rid of that panel on the right-hand side so I could see the slide. I apologize. One of the things that I always like to do when talking about environmental issues or projects or legislation is always kind of fronted with money. I talk about the economics, because economics really drive a lot of things. And here you can see the projections for global sea level rise. 0.5 meter now is sort of like the accepted target, so to speak, by 2050, 2060, which has increased since 2009. And if you look at the IPCC, which is the report in 2007, the 6th assessment report, which just came out, showed that Monterey, there's an interactive diagram that they have there. Monterey and San Francisco have sea level rises of close to about 0.6 meters in the year 2050, 2060. Why isn't this moving? And human impacts are really felt with flooding. Using standard flood protection measures that we normally see, it's estimated by the New England Environmental Finance Center that 150 to 300 million people will be flooded using that type of protection. However, if we go to enhanced sustainable flood protection, which can include salt marshes, basically softening the hard edges, only 1 to 10 million people will be flooded. However, it's not zero, but it's certainly less than 150 to 300 million. And here's what I talk about money. What's happening with disasters is that the insured disaster loss is increasing. However, the insured payment for those losses is not going up as quickly as that. So there's a widening gap, and it's serious money. $113 billion in 2004 alone, and from 1980 to 2020, 1.875 trillion in damages, with 285 weather events. And here's a map of just in 2020, 2 years ago, $1 billion weather and climate disasters. It's startling, all types. Hurricanes, floods, hailstorms, severe weather, earthquakes, firestorms. This is an interesting map. If you ever find it, New York Times at times, I can't believe I said that. At times, this publication has some interesting digital interactive issues. And in this case, you can click on, I thought I had a slide, I did, but I couldn't find it. You can click on a county, because when you expand this, it goes by county. You click on a county, and it'll give you a profile of the disaster event or disaster events that are likely to happen and what its parameters are. There's another great resource, National Institute of Building Sciences. On the left-hand side, you see the type of disaster events. And what they're showing is that by using certain levels of building codes, the benefit cost ratio that can be saved. And this is extremely important. The energy efficiency and renewable energy actually started, it was a pocketbook issue. It started back when there was Arab oil embargo back in the 70s, was it? No, I forgot when it was. But in any case, it was then that people started looking for fuel efficient cars, foreign cars, and then that changed the way that Detroit started looking at things. And then you got into building efficiency because it's a pocketbook issue. You could save money by doing taking sustainable actions. The World Economic Forum in action. We stand to lose 10% of the total economic value from climate change if net zero targets aren't met. Comparing that to COVID-19, it had a global economic shrink of 5%, while the 2008 financial crisis had a 1% global shrinkage. So climate or non-action on climate is a serious dollar issue. So penny wise and pound foolish, penny saved to the dollar earned. It's all about money. And this is one of my favorite slides. Buzzy, as I said, his grandfather, Angelo, when he talks, he's an old Italian guy, he says, the people today, they don't know how to think. Sorry if I woke you up, I'm sorry. Another aspect that's important with dealing about climate or looking about climate or disasters is that normally it's the way government works, but it's geopolitical boundaries. But they don't tell the whole story, nor do they approach the right answers to the questions. Here's the Narragansett Bay Watershed, which is very different than this map here, the watersheds of Rhode Island. So the Narragansett Bay Watershed, you can see it's very large compared to what the Rhode Island map shows. And here's the Narragansett Bay Watershed in a regional context with their neighboring states. Ecoregions here's a map of both North American ecoregions that are geopolitical, because you can see the state boundary lines in white, and it's geospatial. The EPA has 4 levels of ecoregions. This happens to be one of them. This might be level 4. I'm not exactly sure. There are global ecoregions that are mapped. And there are geospatial ecologies of our indigenous Americans. So you could see that political boundaries don't necessarily cut the mustard, so to speak. Our landscape, this is of America, has been shaped by, the geography is shaped by weather, topography, wind, and a number of other forces. Now take a look at California there on the left-hand side. The images that you see there, the next slides will demonstrate how close that image that you see of California in this map of the United States. The California ecoregions from Wikipedia are listed as follows. The map on the left is the California biomes, which is the vegetation and wildlife back to that map of the United States, the geological map of the United States, is that purplish swath down the middle and that brownish swath in the middle on the right. So that raw map of the United States that you saw, which is basically landforms, is very comparable in terms of California relative to your biomes and ecoregions. That's why I talk about ecology. Can we be a Mobius strip? You write built environment on one side of a piece of paper, write natural environment on the other side. You take 2 ends of that piece of paper, you twist them together, you get a Mobius strip, so that the natural environment and the built environment are no longer opposite each other, but they're in one continuous and one seamless surface. You can tell I'm a big fan of Mobius strips. Tony Hiss had some articles in the New Yorker, and this always struck me that our cultural and working landscape of nature and human settlement, as well as our ideas, is where the function and look or character of field has been shaped over time by sequential ongoing human activities as much by natural processes. So we are part of the natural evolution of things. We're not separate from it. So our working landscape, our designs, plans, our initiatives, they are indeed an ecology. I bring this up because I was hired to do a coastal energy impact program. There were 2 nuclear power plants proposed by Narragansett Electric in that area on the right-hand side where you see the green and the white. they were going to go there. This was surplus government land. And what happened was that the town was split 50-50 because part of this coastal energy impact report, I was supposed to do a comprehensive plan. Half the townspeople were for it, half the towns were against it. So I figured, from the experience I had working in the Providence schools with children, why not have the children plan and design the town? And what the backstory to that was, to get that done, the school department said, well, I had to hire a music teacher and an art teacher because they lost the funding. So I went to the National Endowment of the Arts and proposed a Charlestown Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow program with enough funds to hire the art teacher and the music teacher, but also to have the children actually for homework, they would bring planning exercises to their parents. So we engage the parents by engaging the students. And this gets into the difference that children quickly understand that how to discern what's environment and what's ecology. And so I had them, give me a 3-letter word. And you should say, well, you have to have an A and a T and an R so that you can make the words rat, tar, and art. Well, what happens is they quickly learn that word environments have parts, they're letters. You can arrange the parts, changing the arrangements of those parts, those letters, changes that word environment. Changing the word environment changes its meaning. That means it changes its definition. Changing the definition changes the behavior. Changing the behavior changes its ecology. I'm sorry to read that, but I think it's important because ecology is the behavior of an environment. And and I used to get in a tussle with the children. I said, well, rat, tar, and art, they all mean the same thing because they have the same parts. And they go, no, Mr. Felarski, no. And I said, yes, it does. Same parts, same behavior. Till they finally say, no, they're different because you changed the way that the letters were arranged. So children can get it very quickly. And there's an example. They are constructing their natural environment for the town of Charlestown. And here they're building within it. And all the times that I've done this with children back in all the 4th grades in the city of Providence and here and elsewhere, anytime that they've made a tree, made a little hill or a mountain, made a river or a waterway, they've never filled in the waterway, knocked down the hill, or cut down the trees. They always work their sort of town around it. Here's some examples of what they did. This was the early 80s, and they're already thinking about sustainability with the solar panels on the roofs. Did it with underprivileged children in Smith Hill and Providence. Some amazing work that they do. But they get it. Yep, Rhode Island, 3% big ray at low tide. Now, to somewhat the meat of why I'm here, spring floods, 2010. We had 2 500-year floods occurring actually within 3 weeks of each other. Over 20 inches of rainfall from the end of February to the end of March. Pawtucket River, which is the Patuxent River, which was the epicenter of the 500-year floods, 21 feet crested. The difficulty, or why it happened, was that the time of the year and the amount of rain. The soil can only absorb so much. And what we were doing is we're coming off of a tough winter where the ground really didn't thaw that much. So the level of saturation or the potential for saturation was depleted. Also, the amount of impervious surfaces contributed to the runoff. 14% of the watershed had impervious surface. So it not only didn't penetrate, but it made the water move quickly, more quickly than it did. And also, not only soils were not thawed, but there was less capacity from the tree and vegetation roots because they hadn't reached growing season strength. So all these factors together caused these 2 500-year floods. And here's an example, 2 malls. 1951, you could look at the permeable surface area for what then became the site for the 2 malls. And 2008, you look at the impermeable surface area. Now, this is that river running through it. That's a Patuxent River. That is, again, the epicenter of the 500-year floods. And in Oxbow is where you have this tight bend in a river. So like most developers do, they get these fancy names like Pelican Mall or Palm Tree Mall. Why don't they call the Warwick Mall the Oxbow Mall or the Oxbow Incident? This was the Warwick Mall. It's flooding in 2010. It took 2 years for remediation for this mall to get back open. And with flooding, here are the pictures that along the Patuxent River of all the different flooding incidents. The one on sort of up over here is a sewer treatment plant. Route 95 was flooded. That sewer treatment plant runs parallel to 95. That was flooded. That was out for about 7 months. But the good news is that NOAA is developing a flood information modeling. The area of the United States that's in blue that you see there is where it will be implemented within the next, well, now to next year, and it will come out to the rest of the country in the next 3 to 5 years. But what they're able to do is the algorithms that they've constructed are just fascinating because they can get incredibly accurate predictions of what the flooding areas would be. Here's an example of 2 of them. The one on the right is again the Patuxent River and that Warwick Mall. What Dave Valley and his crew did is they created the model based upon the information prior to the 2 500-year floods, and the model actually predicted within 0.5% the flooded areas. So this is coming to the rest of the country, which is good news. Now you ask, why is this map here? What does it have to do with water? But as you could tell, I'm very fascinated with maps. And this is a fascinating map. And it shows how food products flow across the United States. And you can see the heavy lines, the density in California. Why is that important? It's because Los Angeles County both ships and receives the highest amount of food in the country. The proximity to the metropolitan centers, as well as the transportation routes to the Central Valley, is another reason. The top 9 counties that ship the most food by kilogram in all the state of California are in California. So it goes to the critical importance of water. Its supply, whether it's flood inundation and drought, is directly tied to the viability of the economic and social importance of not only food, but people in our country. So water is not only an inundation or a disaster from flood, but it also feeds the country. And so if you have extreme flooding situations, that it's going to be felt nationally. Roy Carpenter's Beach, South Kingston, Rhode Island, a summer beach colony, a view from the beach. Over time, it started out with like simple trailers and tents over pallets. Then it grew to using surplus materials from World War II, 38 hurricane, 94, 44 hurricane. And you could see from 51 to 2002, the relationship of the 38 hurricane overwash. That's what Roy's looked like before the 38 hurricane. And the 38 hurricane, the overwash, you see, it just wiped out the entire colony from that postcard. And the sand was just driven back. And that's the overwash line. Again, the overwash line, the way Roy's looks now in 2000, well, that was 2012. I started working, this was before Sandy. And you could see the shoreline recession over the years. And the money economics comes in again, because this is back in 2012. The town of South Kingstown received a little over $300,000 from the property taxes. And if FEMA had to replace all those little cottages, and they're really dinky little cottages, over $11 million would have to be spent. And 2/3 of the cottages are located in flood zone 1, or flood zone AE, which you can see here. A better picture of the flood zone mapping. So applying sites, which is a Sustainable Sites Initiative and Lead for Neighbor Development at Roy's, some of the principles there, what could be done? So one is the retreat back to the road to the north. The property just south of the road that's running horizontally, it's a cornfield. So the thought was, well, can we use the existing cornfield to move back? Can we relocate the roads between the flood zones? Can we move back the rows of cottages? So came up with this. As you can see, the pictures on the bottom of Roy's, what happened, this was after Sandy. And we were working with them before Sandy to come up with this. It's one family owns the entire property. All the cottages are leased on the land. So we're trying to look at, how do we keep those cottages? Because people really like them. They have a carpe diem attitude, and how much parking is needed. Took the idea of building, working between the flood zones by creating these decks. And I said, deck is a cradle, rockabye baby, but not on the treetop. It's kind of a joke, but the whole idea was you can create a more stable structure for these very flimsy cottages by placing them in basically holes or openings that match the existing cottages on these decks. And we slide the decks in between the flood zones, and they would all be on a deck that's permeable, that's raised, so that the water could do what it does the best, which is to move. And here's some of the design and planning strategies that were used. Move the cottage complex inland, allowing the shoreline and the water to do what it does best, move. Existing cottages are preserved, meaning the vernacular and eclectic architecture and the social relationships that the people have. It maintains a human touch and feel of the place. Get the cottages out of the AE 11 zone, sliding tiles between the flood zones for the new placement of the cottages. Elevate all the cottages on a permanent deck tile, fully accessible, ADA accessible. The decks create a site that's 100% permeable surface, native plantings on the deck, eliminating displacement volumes in flood, and increases the groundwater absorption. Again, we talked about the integrated deck structures. It's the Aesop's fable of lesson the sticks in the bundles, that a bundle of sticks is stronger than a stick. Consolidate relocating the vehicle space inland with permeable surface parking. Locating the roads outside the flood zone. Creating a new coastal cornfield in the flood zones. Now they're not flood zoned, they're not flooded all the time. So flip the cornfield that was to the north of the property, flip it south, and use that cornfield as a permeable parking area. Community photovoltaics, solar, microgrids, utilities run under the deck, geothermal incorporated, solar thermal hot water heating and cisterns for year-round use, gray water recycling, and rainwater collection. And so that's what it looked like. You could see the existing photograph of where the 377 or odd cottages are, how they're shifted back outside of the AE11 flood zones, creating the new coastal cornfields. And where Roy's could have helped, or other communities like that, is there's an idea that started in the Disaster Assistance Committee. We'll be talking to that with Robin's committee in August. The idea is pretty simple. There's this gap between response and recovery where the impetus is to move quickly, get things done, because people want to get back to their homes and businesses quickly. However, or in a quick and safe fashion. However, it doesn't allow time to think about the longer horizon of sustainability. So the idea is to create this design innovation rapid response team that can be called virtually to help at the beckon of the local disaster-stricken community. And they wouldn't be designing things per se, but would be designing programs and making the connections for that community about how to achieve a longer horizon of sustainability that's intelligent as well, as opposed to just building back quickly the way it was, the way before, so that you can get a more holistic, intelligent, and sustainable normal. Well, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm sorry. One of the things that in Rhode Island we incorporated lead for neighbor development and sites into a state law called the Green Buildings Act. And the reason I'm showing that is it's the power of legislation. and what it can do. And it was featured in USGBC magazine. The Kylie Jakes said that she was word limited, but by this next page, you don't think so, because they have all these pictures, including this fat-headed guy up in the upper left-hand corner. But I'm bringing this up because this is an incredible guide for not only resilience, but also in terms of how to deal with water, how to deal with soils. And this is my copy of the site's reference guide, and you could tell I use it a lot. And they have some wonderful principles: do no harm, precautionary principle, design with nature, use a decision-making hierarchy of preservation, conservation, and regeneration, provide regenerative systems, support a living process, use systems thinking, a collaborative and ethical approach, maintain integrity in leadership and research, foster environmental stewardship. And they work off ecosystem services, global and local climate regulation, air and water cleansing, water supply retention, erosion and sediment control, hazard mitigation, pollination, and critical habitat functions, waste composition and treatment, human health and well-being, food and renewable non-food products, cultural benefits. The sites creates, it's not easy, but when you put sustainable landscapes together with sustainable buildings and sustainable neighborhoods, you get a continuum. And this is the direction that we should be going. And sites is really a wonderful compendium of information, and it's a step-by-step process, and I recommend it to all of you. So make things good. To make good things happen, we have to cooperate, coordinate, and collaborate. Excuse me. And we need to do it efficiently, effectively, and elegantly. And elegantly is very important. If you haven't seen this book, A House is a House for Me, wonderful writing and actually incredible illustration. It starts off like a hill is a house for an ant, a hive is a house for a bee, a hole is a house for a mole or a mouse, and I can't see the top. Something is a house for me. But it ends with this: each creature that's known has a house of its own, and the earth is a house for its all. Incredible message. And go back to the Mobius strip. Disaster assistance and communication is a Mobius strip. It's continuous. It should be happening all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Great presentation, both of you, Robin and Ken. Luckily, we have plenty of time to answer some questions, and I would encourage everyone, if you have more questions, there's actually 2 or 3 feeds. The Q&A is the best one, but any final thoughts for your presentations or reactions to each other's presentations, other than just being very complimentary together before we start addressing some of the audience questions, and then and we'll see where that takes us today. Okay, if not, Robin, you can unmute, and we'll take the first question. And they're actually all very compelling. And I'll start with you, Robin. Robin, what is the most challenging aspect of educating clients by architects and planners on sea level rise best practices?
Great question. So I mean, as Ken said, money makes the world go around sometimes, and it's a very compelling argument to talk about how much it costs to do nothing. And fortunately, if any of you have done a BCA, there have been many instances when I've done a BCA is a benefit cost analysis. I should start spelling. I see there's a couple of questions about some terminology that I use that I'm happy to address. But a benefit cost analysis where you're trying to understand, is it worth the investment to design? And almost every instance it is. Granted, I think like being practical about the approach is really important. Not in it to have people spend tons of money just for the sake of designing something. And maybe this answers a question that we'll get to later, but buildings last so long. I said, in New England, we have buildings that are really old, and that's great, but most buildings don't last that long. Most buildings are not from the 1600s. So they do have a lifespan. A lot of the systems in them have lifespans. So I like to sort of match up the scenario I'm planning for and designing for with planned capital improvements. so that you can take a more realistic approach to adapting for flooding.
Wonderful, wonderful. Actually, Katie asked a continuing question in the same venue. What's the best way to convince the community that we're trying to be good neighbors in developing our plans?
Oh, that's you know what? It's challenging because I think communities often, there's two sort of mindsets. One is you assume that the government's going to take care of you and take care of this problem, and it's not yours. So you just kind of put your belief in their hands that they're doing something. And if you're a really active and a believer in preparing, then you advocate to your communities to take care of it. But the reality is, like, people have issues that affect them now that are really important to them and take up their lives and what they're really, so it's challenging, right? Like, I think it's really on those people who can take the time, who can advocate for help in adaptation and making change for the better for everybody, because not everyone has that ability to do it.
I'd like to just chime in here relative to Roy Carpenter's beach. It's said a single landowner and 384 cottage land leases. We took a poll, and they overwhelmingly retreat and elevate. That was the answer. Ask them to do it, they don't want to do it. Why? It's a summer colony. I use the carpe diem. They just want to go down there and have some fun. And so part of the premise is that if it's a rather simple socioeconomic ecosystem, if we can't make that happen, how, you think about the difficulties and the barriers in a larger urban, ecosystem, that Robin's dealing with. So it's difficult. There's psychology of people is so embedded in decision making.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that addition. I'll move over to you now, Ken. There was a great question that came in. It says, Ken, can you expand on the implications for planning on design using disaster cycles and community resilience and disaster loss of weather events? You know more than I do about that, but that was a great question. I thought you might be able to address quickly.
Could you repeat?
Yeah,
that?
it was basically what they're saying is how does this impact community resilience, sea level rise? I think that's probably the easiest way for me to translate it.
Significantly. We just had a presentation. John Miller, who's a fellow Disaster Assistance Committee member, he's a professional engineer and a certified floodplain manager, as I am. But FEMA tasked him to the Senate Banking Committee. What's coming out now is their banks and insurance companies, I'm not just talking about flood insurance companies, they're taking the financial risk more and more into their equations as to what they're going to finance and as to what levels. And they're looking at sea level rise and the properties there. They're also looking at the vulnerability of those properties. The World Economic Forum, with that slide, says I guess maybe they just finished meeting or they're still in Davos now. But again, economics is driving so much of it. And so yes, it's a major factor. I will say though, I just saw a video, 2 identical homes. It was a testing lab in South Carolina, built to look the same, and one was built to fortified standards. If anybody's not familiar with that, you could look it up. It stood. The other one was just blown to smithereens. So it's pretty interesting. So if you're going to build right.
Outstanding. Another question for both of you. It's not open-ended. Morteza asks, does resiliency mean a temporary solution to flooding, or these buildings are going to be designed to stay in water permanently like Venice? If the sea levels are rising, are we anticipating that they go down?
A good question. So I'll start at the last part, which is that the sea levels are rising. Are we anticipating that they go down? I'm not a climate scientist, so I cannot tell you if they go down. And I can tell you that the models that we use, these predictive models, are based on emission scenarios that are widely like used in many different types of modeling scenarios. So I don't know if they're going to go down. Potentially, maybe. Like I said before, buildings are permanent, have this permanency for us, but they're temporary on the planet in a lot of ways. And so we are not necessarily designing for them to be permanent forever, because, we're designing for instance, for us, we're designing for this end of century scenario, because that's what science tells us we can design for reasonably. And it would be really hard or wild to design for some unknown scenario. And I think like it's really helping us invest more wisely now in how we adapt, with science backing how we are anticipating things will go. So no, we're not necessarily expecting buildings to be permanent. And actually, can I just really quickly jump down to a question about historic structures? Because I think this is kind of a related topic. For instance, somebody asked about historic structures. I had helped to adapt a historic structure on the waterfront in Boston, the Boston Fish Pier building, and deployables were honestly like one of the only solutions in that case, because there are regulations and requirements of which we are, protecting historic structures, trying to prevent them from getting damaged. And there's this like, do you do something and alter this thing that we value, this piece of architectural art in a lot of ways, or do we find a way to protect it? And that's one of the things, like, we use deployables in a lot of situations when there isn't another option and you want to protect something. And keep in mind, like, sea level rise is going to rise a few feet. A lot of the things that we're designing for are sea level rise plus a big storm occurring at the same time, which is when we typically get these like very hazardous situations, and you have a lot of loss in those instances.
There's also storm surge, which adds to it. And the other thing is that being on the East Coast, we're mostly concerned about coastal storms, but riverine inundation is critical, and that's why some of those maps I brought up about California, the rivers and the water supply in California are so critical, not only to habitat, but obviously to your economy relative to food production.
And that kind of goes also too. Thank you for that. It says also, there was a question from James that's similar to what we're talking about. What about stormwater retention built into buildings? That was an interesting question, and I'll let the experts sort of address that, because I think it could go in a wonderful direction.
Mold.
True.
No,
Very true.
Yeah. So mold is one of the biggest, that's the after flooding concern. That is really how buildings get taken down often, or people are really public health and people are impacted post flooding events. But I will say we are integrating stormwater retention into a lot of buildings now. And I just kind of want to go back to this idea of extreme precipitation flooding. Your building may not be flooded, but every building plays a really important role in preventing their neighbor from being flooded. So when I'm talking about blue roofs or stormwater retention systems, impervious surface, it may not prevent you from getting flooded, But if everybody can do that, if a lot of people, a lot of buildings do that, and you can capture the stormwater, then you are collectively minimizing the amount of flooding that could occur. So I think it's an important piece of this, you know, looking at buildings and ways to hold water, and a lot of it isn't just holding water forever. It's not like detaining it and keeping it. It's just holding it until the peak of the storm goes, and then allowing the water to come out into the stormwater system.
Well, you know, reducing impervious surfaces, reducing parking lots. Like everybody knows, seems to know that parking lots are oversized in terms of parking requirements, and many municipalities are actually downsizing their parking requirements. And then having a sustainable landscape, the landscape itself can be a passive flood mitigation element in design. That's one of the things about the sites manual that I showed. They talk about it, that sustainable sites are regenerative, and they actually then say, as opposed to buildings, which are degenerative, because a sustainable site grows and becomes better. Buildings fall apart. You know, they have to repair this, fix that, whatnot. It's an interesting concept, but if the two things can merge together, it'd be wonderful.
And Ken, there was a great question. How can one find a copy of Sites for the Office?
I Googled the answer, but the site is, it was started by the U.S. Botanical Garden, the American Society of Landscape Architects Foundation, and the Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Center at University of Texas, Austin. And it was purchased by USGBC and GBCI. So if you Google the Sustainable Sites Initiative, you should, there's a whole website there, or just Google sites, all uppercase. There's the manual that I showed is the one that you need to purchase. There's one that has all the same information, but not a lot of not as much backup, and that you could download that for free.
Wonderful, wonderful. That was important, because I was thinking about trying to get a copy of for myself even. We're sort of coming up towards the end, and we have time for, say, one more question for both of our panelists, Robin and Ken. There's so many good questions that are coming in even now as we speak. We'll try to get those answered through AIA California staff. Of course, we record this, so look for something soon for that. But at the end here, there was one question that came in, and it says, Robin and Ken, what are the biggest challenges design thinkers and doers face in the long term and short term for sea levels and the natural and built environments? That's kind of open-ended, but perspective might be a wonderful way to sort of end each of your topics.
I'm a big fan of Pareto's law, the 20-80 rule, or 80-20 law rule. Basically, it comes down to is that 20%. The first, well, you look at the architect's curve. You know, what they do in the design process. The first 20% of any project, or the first 20% of decisions you make, affect 80% of the outcome. And I'll push it back to a 10-90 rule. The first 10% of the project determines 90% of the outcomes. Now, whether you're talking about a building or developing a cohesive strategy for addressing the issues that was brought up, we need better information, more information to make strategic decisions early on, and it should be all integrated.
I was going to add that I think holistically is the answer. If we're asking about how to design for the natural and built environment, there's a thought process that sort of needs to occur, which you think, how do I protect both? How do I utilize both to achieve better results for this? And so I think, like, ultimately think about what the benefit should be. I mentioned that architects play this really important critical role in that we have the ability to think about this big picture. And I think one of the things that we're really, really great at thinking about is what are the outcomes? What am I trying to achieve? And then trying to figure out the ways to get there. And it's not always so straightforward, but I think we're we're really uniquely suited to take that challenge on.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Ken, I'm going to add to it. I think it's even better than the 20-80 percentage. I think it's more like 5%, 95%. That what you do in the first 5% of your design, when you sit down with your pencil at your desk, thinking through how you're going to design a project or implement some strategy for a project, that really carries the rest of the project and success holistically.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm
Yeah.
glad Robin used that word because like people always say, well, LEED buildings cost more, won't I? Because with the Green Buildings Act. No, if you put all that information, you strategically integrate it at the beginning, it won't. But usually what happens is people say, oh, we should do this. And you're like halfway through or 3/4 of the way through. You're saving nickels and dimes at the end instead of, the big dollars in the front end.
Yeah. And I found that we've came a long way with our clients because our clients are getting more savvy in the way that they look at our current conditions, geopolitically and globally, how we're dealing with all the things that are coming across our design desks, and people like you on the front lines, promoting best practices. So thank you. We are coming up towards the end. There are so many questions. I could go on if anyone would like to, but I think we're supposed to stop. A big thank you to Robin and to Ken for this excellent presentation and wonderful discussion. If you've made it this far, the AIA California staff will submit you for AIA credit. It should appear on your transcript in a few weeks. As always, more resources and tools can be found on the AIA California's website, aiacalifornia.org, Climate Action. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you so much, Robin, and so much, Ken, for sharing all of this delightful information. We'll see you at the next Climate Action webinar. Have a great day, everyone. We'll sign off now. Bye-bye.